Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
All right, welcome to So Many Books, So Little Time. My name is Joe Nash. I'm here with Zina, Shevchik. We are both librarians here at the Colonie Library for show 36. And the premise is very simple if you've never seen it. Zina and I go down to the new bookshelf here in the library, right where you come in, the books with the yellow stickers on them. And we go to the back to our technical services department where they're processing all the new books, which we get every week. And we've brought up a bunch of new books to tell you about. We usually don't get to all of them, but we will try. So Zina, we'll go first.
Okay. My first book is called To America with Love by A. Gill, Gill. This is a kind of a tribute to the America that this author knows. He was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, and he lives in London, but he writes for some American magazines, and he's written some rather hilarious books about London and England, and he is kind of comparing the old world, meaning Europe and England, with America. And it's a lot of it's tongue-in-cheek. It's very funny, very clever, very witty. He has relatives who actually emigrated to the U.S., and that branch of his family apparently did really well in Detroit, and Grosse Pointe is, I guess, a well-known, wealthy area of Detroit. So he dreams, kind of daydreams about what his life would have been like if his section of the family chose to move to America. It's very entertaining, and he talks about the extremes of America, but again, all with a great sense of humor, and he talks about why Europe kind of disdains some things American. I really, really enjoyed it, and I think anyone who wants a new perspective of America other than the stereotypical view of America that we think Europeans have. To America with Love, A. Gill. And one thing I'm going to do when I finish this episode is to go try to find out what his initials AA stand for, because I'm always interested in why authors don't put their real names and use their initials.
So sounds like it's a pen name.
No, it's not.
Okay. I think the guy who wrote Perry Mason had a pen name, A. Flair, I think.
Oh, yeah?
Okay, now, is that book, is that essays? Is it a travel book, or is it a memoir?
No, it's not a travel book. They're essays, and it's just a European's perspective of America.
Okay.
That's all.
Well, my first book might be a different perspective of America, unfortunately. It's a book you may have heard of. It's called 5 Days at Memorial. Memorial being the hospital in New Orleans that a doctor and one nurse were put on trial for euthanizing patients during Hurricane Katrina. This is an amazing book. It's a haunting book. The author won the Pulitzer Prize for a different book. Very compelling read. You sort of almost can't put it down, even though you know what happened and everything. It's a pretty amazing book.
Is it like a chronology?
Yes, it goes right in order. First half of the book is the situation, and she interviewed everybody. This book took her 5 years to write. And it's very interesting how she'll say so-and-so did or said something, and then they'll say, well, this person I didn't do that. So in all this mass confusion of the hurricane, can you imagine being trapped in a hospital, hurricane, you got floodwaters coming up, it's 100 degrees, no electricity. You've got a whole floor where this mostly takes place, a whole floor of...
Yeah, it's a high rise, isn't it? I mean,
Well, it was
quite a few.
7 or 8 stories.
Yeah, yeah.
You have a whole wing of people who are in intensive care, and some decisions were made, and she goes into all this, and she talks to everybody, and it's really, I don't know, it's a very sad story, but you don't know how you're going to act in total chaos.
Well, it's
and
ethical dilemmas.
And almost anarchy. But the first half of the book is the situation, what happened, as best as she can piece it together, because she gets some conflicting stories about what people said and did. Second half of the book is the investigation and the trial. And ultimately, the one doctor and the one nurse were acquitted. I haven't got to that yet, but all kinds of ethical issues are raised and human behavior issues. And you almost can't put it down, even though you know it's a very compelling read, very well written. Sherry Fink is also a doctor, so she can really explain a lot of these issues very well. So a really haunting book, a really sad book, and it wasn't just Memorial Hospital. Right now I'm at the part where there were other hospitals and nursing homes where many bodies had really higher than normal levels of morphine and things. And I don't really remember whatever happened in those cases. Maybe I'm at page 300, and I have 100 pages left, but it's an amazing book. 5 Days at Memorial by Sherry Fink.
I would think that would be really good, like, book club material, because people could talk about the ethical issues.
Oh, yeah.
Because what would you do if if you were forced to make decisions about people you see suffering?
Yes. Well, when you read the story, when you read it,
yeah, I know.
On the day of the injections of the 19 people that had really high levels, that was the day all the helicopters came and most people were getting out, but for some reason, they don't really delve into. They just decided these people aren't going to go. There's all kinds of reasons given. You'll have to read it.
Yeah, well, I remember last fall when they were evacuating newborns from the neonatal unit of a hospital in New York City during Sandy, and how difficult they said it was to move.
A lot of people in this book are totally heroic.
Right.
And then some made some decisions that were I don't know.
Okay.
It would be a good book discussion group. I don't know if book discussion groups like 480-page books. Although it reads really fast, you really almost can't put it down.
Yeah.
It's amazing. So
Okay.
Anyway.
Well, my next book is about, it's similar to the book I just talked about, the To America with Love. This is a slightly different perspective. It's called The Inconvenient Indian, a curious account of Native people in North America. Grapples with even the definitions or the words of Indian or reservations. He is an Indian himself, but he's from Canada. He points out that Native Americans, or they call them First Nations in Canada, don't really recognize the line between the United States and Canada because their tribes, now I don't even know, come to think of it, if that's the word they use for their groups of people, their tribes transcend the geographic boundaries, the political geographic boundaries. But he approaches it also with wit and humor and tongue-in-cheek, and he doesn't call it a history. In the foreword, he explains why he calls it an account rather than a history, just why and he also explains why he uses the word curious to describe this account. But the photograph, the picture on the...
Like I say, the cover is really, really nice.
There's
really
an ocean liner, it's something like the Titanic, with pulling into port, you assume at the beginning of the development of the U.S. and Canada, and down here is what we would call a redskin, in the full a cartoonish kind of character of the Native American with the full headgear, the full war headdress, and so the juxtaposition. But I found this funny, really pointed, but funny and useful for all of us to understand the Native American and First Nations of Canada perspective. I just think it's really clever. It won't make you feel guilty. It'll just make you laugh and say, yeah, he has a point. He demystifies, demythologizes. He debunks the myths of the hostile Indian and the heroic whites, which we know can be fraught with tension, but he presents it in a really palatable way. And I really enjoyed what I've read, and I'm going to enjoy reading the rest of it too. So.
All right. Well, that's the second book you said was funny, witty, and charming.
Yes, I have others.
I'm glad you're balancing out my books here. My second book here after the Hurricane Katrina. This book is called The Good Funeral: Death, Grief, and the Community of Care, by co-authors Thomas Long and Thomas Lynch. Thomas Long is a theologian. He's written a lot about death and dying and grieving and theology. Thomas Lynch is an undertaker who's written many books about being an undertaker, which I have read two of them. They were really good. One's called The Undertaking. One's called Bodies in Motion. Last year, or a couple years ago on PBS, I don't know if you remember this, I think it was on Frontline. It was what it was like working in an American funeral home in 2007 or 8, whenever it was on. It was called The Undertaking, and it was about Thomas Lynch and his family. They run this place in, I think it's Minnesota. So Thomas Lynch has written a lot about from an undertaker's perspective. Thomas Long writes from the perspective of the spiritual, I guess you could say, and it's alternate chapters, and they're both. This book's getting good reviews, and I think. Like I say, I know Thomas Lynch's work, good writer, and I think it's safe to say that in the last 10 years or so, I think a lot of attitudes toward death and funerals have really changed in America, don't you think?
Like 6 foot under, that's all I'm thinking about.
But I mean, attitudes toward death and funerals have really changed in the last 10 years. Think about going to a wake or a funeral when you were a kid as opposed to now. I mean, things have really changed, mainly people's attitudes and things, and this book goes into all that. And one of the things, this is from the, I didn't read it yet, but this is from the inside jacket here. It says, Thomas Long and Thomas Lynch alternately discuss several challenges facing the good funeral, including the commercial aspects that have led many to be suspicious of funeral directors, and sometimes the tense relationship between pastors and funeral directors, the tendency of modern funerals to exclude the body from the service, and the rapid growth in cremation. So if this book piques your interest, I'll just tell people watching, on Friday, November 15th, this book's going to be the subject of our noon book review here in the library. Come to the library, and our speaker who's going to talk about this book, her name is Paula, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. Her name is Paula Gravel. She's the executive director of the New York State Council of Churches. And before that, for many, many years, she was the director of pastoral care at Ellis Hospital. So she'll probably tell us all about this book and give us a nice perspective on it, see what she thinks about it. But a book, again, getting good reviews. Both authors, Thomas Lynch particularly, pretty famous. He's written poetry and everything. So The Good Funeral: Death, Grief, and the Community of Care, Changing Attitudes Toward Death and Funerals.
All you baby boomers out there.
So I hope do you have another witty, charming, and funny book now?
Yes, sort of.
Good.
I think it is. This one is called, maybe after going to that program or reading that book, you'll want to read this. The Drunken Botanist, Plants That Create the World's Great Drinks. Amy Stewart, author of Wicked Plants, a New York Times bestseller. I remember talking about her, at least one of her other books. And this is fascinating. Now, I'm not much of a drinker. You know, I'll have one beer or one gin and tonic, but I haven't a clue about where any of this comes from, except that because I have a Russian background, I know that vodka comes from potatoes. So that's about all I know. And so this is great. I mean, it's chatty. It's got so much information and all sorts of different kinds of information. I mean, she's just remarkable. It's really small print. I will warn people, but the recipes are have lots of white space. Very easy to read.
Were they recipes for drinks?
They're recipes for drinks, but the primary point of it is to. It's kind of like an encyclopedia. She talks, in a very chatty, informal way about what fermentation is and what distillation is, and how the history of all these alcoholic drinks. Like one page here is called The Birth of Vodka, and then the next page talks about sweet potatoes and the history of the sweet potato and how it eventually was used for some kind of drink and alcohol. And it's hilarious and it's very, very informative. She starts out with the classics, what she calls about the classics, what creates the sugar, whether it's a potato or corn or whatever, and whether you use yeast or bacteria, how the two come together, who started it, and it's in the middle. It goes to the fruits that they use for. They use the herbs and spices to create a special alcohol, and in the end, it talks more about seeds, other things they use to spice up the drinks. But it's really informative. It's hilarious. It's something you can just browse through and pick out what you want to look at. I never really knew what cardamom was. It explains what cardamom is. It talks about black currants and how you can't get it over here. It tells you what a clove is. It mentions a Douglas fir. It has a couple of pages on Douglas fir. Apparently, there's some alcohol that comes from a Douglas fir. The Drunken Botanist, the plants that create the world's great drinks. She says this idea about this came when she was attending a gardening conference. So it's great. I mean, it's really wonderful.
There was probably some drinking at the conference, I would.
Yeah, I guess so.
All right, now, after my last two books, I don't know which way to go here. I'll go with something a little more upbeat. Now, this combines two things that I really love. You know, I'm a big fan of Library of America, uniform editions of America's greatest authors. They've been coming out since the late 90s. You will recognize them by the black cover and the sides. This is the latest from the Library of America. It's a 2-volume set. I only have one here because one was checked out. This is in 2 volumes, the complete short stories of John Updike. One is called Collected Early Stories. A picture of young.
Oh, look at that picture of him! Wow.
A picture of young John Updike on here. The Collected Later Stories is John Updike is silver white hair and very distinguished looking. These are his John Updike stories. The two volumes bring together all his short stories, 185, I think. And this one are among my all-time favorite works by John Updike. You know, he's known as a novelist, but he was a great short story writer, really great short story writer. And this is his stories, early stories, has some of my all-time favorite writings by him. Pigeon Feathers, a very famous, maybe his most famous short story. Ace in the Hole, which became the model for all the Rabbit books. A little 10-page short story about an ex-basketball player that was his first story he wrote, too. You can see how he had that theme, his whole. I'll read some of these because some of these are pretty famous. Snowing in Greenwich Village, the first Maple story. A&P, a much anthologized story. The Happiest I've Been, one of my personal favorite stories about growing up. Packed Dirt, Church Going, A Dying Cat, A Traded Car. That was the title. That's a really great story. And again, I think this one has 100 and something. So the 2 volumes, however, exclude the Maple stories, which was I think 10 or 15 stories about this couple, Joan and Richard Maple, I think were their name, and it chronicles their meeting when they're young, their marriage and having kids, and their subsequent divorce, and then I think the last story in the series is called Grandparenting, even though they both remarried, they're both so it follows their life stories. So he wrote about them intermittently through his career, and it excludes the Henry Beck stories. His an alter ego writer. There was a bunch of stories. The first story in each, the first Maple story, the first Henry Beck story are in here though, because I don't know, he may not have known he was going to continue. So 2 volumes. If you only know John Updike from his novels, he's a great, great short story writer. 2 volumes, collected early stories, which I'm holding. We also own collected later stories, 185 stories.
Great. See, you've piqued my interest. So many books, so little time. Now I'm going to try and
How
pick
could
that
you
up.
not have come across John
Well, look
Updike?
at you. Oh, I know him from the Rabbit.
But these early stories, particularly the early stories about growing up in Pennsylvania, he put them together in one collection called the Ollinger Stories. Are great. They're the greatest.
Well, you just did a great job of
Oh,
promoting that. That was wonderful.
Well, John Updike, I love John Updike.
Obviously, and your passion comes through. Now, I'm going to put these 2 books together because it's the way I like to get history. I've mentioned that before on this program, and this is literary history. This is called Lillian and Dash, a novel by Sam Toporoff. And this book is Zelda, a novel of Zelda Fitzgerald by Therese Ann Fowler. Now, the Zelda book has been on the New York Times bestseller list for quite a while, and I just never got to read it. And so these are both novels, but they trace the lives of these writers, and it's the way I like to get history, a little bit of popular commentary. This Zelda book is told from her point of view, so it's using a first person. And
That's yet another fictionalized account of the famous authors. There's a whole bunch
right,
of these.
like and I really enjoyed. We talked about the Paris wife, Hemingway, and so this is about Lillian Hellman and Dashiell Hammett. Am I saying it right?
Yeah, Dashiell Hammett.
And he's best known for The Maltese Falcon, and she's best known for her Children's Hour. But they had a very
she wrote plays.
She wrote plays too, and there have been movies and other TV programs done on both of them. For sure, but they're fascinating characters, and the time they lived was fascinating as well, during the McCarthyism and the wars, and so it's a really passionate love affair, obviously, as I'm told.
Zelda and Scott.
Scott.
Well, I think they both were very tumultuous relationships.
Yeah.
Is that the right word?
Right, that's it, you got it. So I'm in the middle of Zelda, and I'm going to read this Lillian and Dash as well. So Lillian and Dash, a novel, Sam Toporoff, that name sounds familiar to me, I don't know why. And Zelda Z, a novel of Zelda Fitzgerald.
I know, there's all these books coming out with using famous people.
Yes, it's become its own genre.
It is, that's like the
subgenre.
last couple of years. All right, my next book, in 2009, I think, 9 or 10, I can't remember, David Finkel wrote a book called The Good Soldiers, which he wrote, he was embedded with one unit, one battalion, one little unit, whatever, and he stayed with them for, I think, over a year over in Iraq during the surge, 2007 or 8, around there. And it was an amazing book. It was a heartbreaking book. It was a disturbing book. It was well written. It was, in some ways, a very heroic book. And he followed this one troop around, or this one battalion, or one squad, like, I don't know, 15 or 20. And he actually went out with them. He didn't just go and report. This is when they had all those. They kept going out in convoys just to show their presence. And inevitably every day, one always got hit or blown up or ran over a mine. And he just covered what it was like living like that with these guys. And he goes into the backstory of several of the people, the commander. But interestingly, he starts reporting on them before they even went over to Iraq. He went through the training with them, and he talks about what it was like over there, living on the base. And then when they went on leave, he actually reported on them what it was like on leave. And you can say it was very heartbreaking, a lot of it, because some of them got injured, some of them died, some of them had amputations. So anyway, that book was called The Good Soldiers, and it was a great book. So now 5 years later, he has written a book called Thank You for Your Service, and he goes back and revisits the same platoon, the same guys, they're all out. So now he's reporting from America and the effects of war. There was already an excerpt in last week's New Yorker, which I read, which was like, heartbreaking is another word. But some people in the are fine. They've adjusted. Some of them have a lot of problems. Some of them have physical problems. Many of them have mental or psychological problems. So he's embedded again with the same battalion. I think they're called the 216 Infantry Battalion, and he covers their rehabilitation, how they're coping, living with their family, and sometimes their families have. He talks to their families, and like I say, I only read one excerpt, and it was really, really fantastic, well written, very sad, but anyway, this is the whole book. It just came out. It's a sequel to, I guess you could say, The Good Soldiers, which I think might have won the Pulitzer Prize. I'm not sure. It was like Book of the Year, if New York Times. So this is his new book, David Finkel. Thank You for Your Service. Might be a bit of an ironic title. He goes into what that means when you say that, and how these guys take it, and what. So it looks like a very harrowing book. Like I say, the excerpt I read last week in the New Yorker was about a guy trying to adjust with his wife, and he's going to rehab, and he's going to psychological counseling, and he's got all this rage, But I mean, that's only one guy.
We should all know about it.
Yeah, and I think he does report on people that have come back and are doing really well. I mean, it isn't everyone, but he's trying to cover the same. It's a lot of the same men who were in The Good Soldiers. So that's David Finkel. Thank you for your service. Zina?
Do I have time for another?
Yes.
Okay, this one's a little bit more lighthearted. This is called Time Magazines. Is it still a magazine? I don't know.
Yeah, it still comes out.
The 100 Most Influential People Who Never Lived. All sorts of characters in literature, in movies.
You should point out who's on the cover
TV. There. Yes. Well, tell them who it is, Joe.
It's Homer Simpson.
He's pretty little.
I know.
He's pretty little. He's a much bigger character than that implies. So it's not a long book.
I think of him as a real person.
You think, I know, and that's the point, but that's the point of this book, that people who never lived, characters who were never actually alive, how they actually permeate our culture, and how we do almost think of them as alive,
you mean
and how they've
like
affected
Superman
us.
Or something?
Yes,
Okay.
there's cartoon characters in here, but there's also the Marlboro Man, which maybe people who aren't over the age of 40 might not know who the Marlboro Man is. And next to him is, he sold cigarettes.
Okay.
He was an advertising character who sold Marlboro cigarettes. And right next to him is the character of Rosie the Riveter, who as well is this says the origin, a 1943 popular song of the same name by Red Evans. And I only know her, now this is a picture of Rosie the Riveter by Norman Rockwell, 1943. We all know who Norman Rockwell is, but I only thought of her as an advertising character for World War II when the women were working in the factories. But they have some interesting juxtaposition. Here's Jay Gatsby. We've all been treated to another movie of the novel by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and so there's Mia
All right, so you
Farrow.
got a lot of fictional characters.
Right, but there's the juxtaposition of Hull and Caulfield from The Catcher in the Rye, next to Don Draper from the Mad Men. They actually, some of the commentary on each of these characters, some of it is done by people who either played these characters or wrote about these characters. Here's another interesting juxtaposition. Michael Corleone from The Godfather next to Raskolnikov, who's the character in Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment novel. Crime and Punishment, which was written in 1866. They have Jodie Foster writing about Hannibal Lecter. They have Mary Tyler Moore writing
is it
about
more modern
Mary.
people?
Well, that
is
was
like,
1860. Sherlock
is like
Holmes,
Hamlet in there?
Achilles. No, yeah. Odysseus is here. Achilles is here.
All right, so it's
I think it's fascinating what they chose, who they chose, what characters they chose, and how it is true that these characters are almost like living beings in our psyche.
They're more real than some people.
Yeah, right. I mean, this is our connection in some way. And so some of us only connection to our culture is through some of these characters. So I just think it's an interesting book.
I was looking at that when it came in.
The Homer Simpson, I'm the only one on the cover. The 100 most influential people who never lived. Time magazine.
All right, I'll do one more. Since it seems like that book was mainly about American sort of.
Well, Harry Potter's in here. Phantom of the Opera, Gerard Butler. Well, there's Shylock.
Okay.
There's some English.
Well, here's an interesting book. It's one of those books I would look at and pick up. I might actually read. It's on one hand
Wait
it looks.
a minute.
On one hand it looks almost. You can't believe someone wrote it. On the other hand, it looks, well, wait a minute, maybe there's something to this. This book is called America's Obsessives, The Compulsive Energy That Built a Nation. And I think the author's premise, Joshua Kendall, author of The Forgotten Founding Father, his premise is that a lot of the energy that built America were, I'm laughing because I read the beginning.
Demented.
He says a lot of these people who had sort of obsessive compulsive personality disorder. I don't mean he means it literally, but
yes.
this overwhelming drive, like someone like Thomas Edison, just to really,
Right.
And he goes through. There's an introductory chapter where he uses Steve Jobs as a bit of a model, but and then like for example, the DSM. The standard diagnostics manual that defines all mental disorders, they described obsessive compulsive personality disorder this way: preoccupation with details, rules, order, lists, organizations, or schedules; perfectionism, excess devotion to work; inflexibility about matters of morality, ethics, or values. This does sound like a very American kind of.
Yeah.
When I tell you the people, you'll. Reluctance to delegate tasks unless others submit to exactly his way of doing things.
I think
rigidity and stubbornness.
The great Santini.
That's a he never lived.
I know.
Right. So anyway, there's an introductory chapter. He talks about. I don't think he means these people literally had OCPD, but he kind of it's a
borderline.
It's a jumping off point to talk about America, the cult of work, and the nose to the grindstone and everything, and the people he chooses to profile. And I guess some of these people I had read a little bit about. I guess perhaps they were, really driven. But I'll read you. So then he has 7 chapters with this little thesis he has. Thomas Jefferson, Henry Heinz, the ketchup guy, but he had a big,
ego.
No, well, he had a big, a big business empire.
Okay.
Mr. Melville Dewey, he of the Dewey Decimal System. There was some obsessiveness there. We got to laugh.
Yeah, I think.
Alfred Kinsey. I read a book about him. He was pretty obsessive about.
Been movies.
Yes,
yeah.
he was. Charles Lindbergh. Now, not only was he, the aviator and all that, but he had families in 3 different countries that no one ever knew about. Estee Lauder. she of the perfume
Yeah.
empire.
Yeah.
And finally, Ted Williams, who is known as an obsessive
I think he might have had a
studying and his swing and his baseball and all that. So, an interesting premise. I mean, I think, and of course, unlike the books you told, I don't think he's doing this in a tongue-in-cheek, lighthearted way. I think he's actually trying to make a point about maybe America's,
It's not complimentary, you're saying.
well, particularly in the 1800s and the industrialization and all that. There was a lot of people. Some people, like these people made tons of money, but a lot of people ended up, living poor lives. So anyway, this book actually looks kind of interesting. America's Obsessives, the Compulsive Energy That Built a Nation. The cover is interesting. It's a bunch of Post-its, kind of in the shape of the United States.
Yeah, it's close to the shape.
So do you have?
That's interesting. That perspective with A.A. Gill's perspective to America with Love.
I mean, Steve.
Because Gill talks about that, the drive.
Yeah, and I mean,
America.
the first chapter about Steve Jobs, he was very driven. I don't know if he was obsessive compulsive, but he was very driven, and he made Apple what it is today.
Right.
Apple would not have been what it became without him. I mean, not anyone else. It was only he could have done that, I think. So.
Well, if we have time, I'll do another one.
You have time? Sure, do one more.
Okay.
Do one more.
I enjoyed learning about this. This book was on the New York Times bestseller list, but just in case some of you don't know about it, The Astronaut Wives Club, A True Story by Lily Koppel. I never did find out if she's related to Ted Koppel. I meant to check that out. But this is, now, baby boomers, I was born in 1949, so the whole Gemini space program, everything was...
Well, Mercury was first.
Mercury,
the original,
sorry, you got me.
The original
right.
Mercury. Was that the wives of the original seven?
Well, it continued from Mercury, yes, to Gemini
to Apollo.
To Apollo, right? And yes, this
to the space
there is still in existence the Astronaut Wives Club, and they support each other, all the spouses of all these men who were in the space program and who actually went into space. This is my time and a little bit of yours, but I remember John Glenn, and I remember hearing about Sputnik and the Russian space vehicle. It wasn't a vehicle.
Well, that would be the Cosmonauts Wives Club.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, it talks about that a little bit. But this is their perspective, what their lives were like, the wives of the astronauts, how their men were never there, how they had to rely on each other, how dangerous not even the going into space, but yes, of course, the going into space, but the training, and it talks about the marketing of the astronauts and how the wives had to be perfect and seeming to be perfect, and what was actually going on in their lives. It really isn't a tell-all scandal book at all. It just is kind of a forthright description of what happened to them and their lives, and how they still are in contact with each other. And they decided that this was the time to tell.
Have you read that book?
I've read a lot of it.
Is it good?
I really enjoyed it.
It was on the bestseller list. In
Yes.
fact, the Tom Wolfe book, The Right Stuff, some of the most interesting parts of that book are, that book was about the original 7 Mercury astronauts. The parts in The Right Stuff about the wives were really, really interesting. He got into it too, the Tom Wolfe did. So that was...
It's fascinating how they really, how little they were...
Well, Life magazine they ghost wrote all their life stories.
Right, and that's what they're talking about. This picture is from
book,
Life magazine, and how the women are all perfectly coiffured, and they all have these pastel-colored shirtwaist dresses. I mean, these are real people.
Yeah,
I mean, they're strong women, strong women.
Read that.
And it just gives, again, it's a kind of a feminist point of view, but there was no feminism in their lives then. It talks about how they lived in a certain suburb all together, and it's just fascinating.
Okay, I've read a lot of books on the space program. I'll have to read that.
Yeah, excellent.
Their wives did come up in the other books.
Yep,
right.
Excellent.
Well, that is it for this time, and we'll see you next time on So Many Books, So Little Time.